If you've ever met someone who doesn't post on social media, who leaves no digital footprint, who rarely, if ever, updates stories, selfies, or status logs, you may have noticed something peculiar about their presence. It is heavy, grounded, and self-contained, like a mountain that does not need to announce itself to be tall, like a river that does not need to perform to continue flowing, like a craftsman who values the work more than the applause. And this non-posting behavior hides an entire psychology many of us rarely examine, because we live in a civilization that believes visibility is proof of life. Yet, for those who resist the compulsion to broadcast, the inner life becomes the primary arena of accomplishment and the wellspring of power. And that is exactly what we're going to explore today: the deep, often misunderstood psychology of people who don't post on social media. These are not necessarily antisocial hermits or technophobes frozen in a past century, and they are not always the too cool for the internet elitists either, because often they are ordinary people with uncommon clarity about attention, identity, and energy. People who have discovered that the price of constant exposure is an erosion of interiority. People who understand instinctively that an unguarded soul becomes public property, and people who know that when everything is shared, nothing is sacred. So they protect their sacred things, not out of fear, but out of fidelity to what truly matters to them. In Jungian terms, their choice is often an expression of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are beneath the noise of collective opinion. Because individuation requires a relationship with the unconscious, and that relationship is born in silence, in solitude, in the unlit room of the mind where images rise without an audience, where thoughts aren't dressed for the algorithm, and where the self whispers in a dialect that cannot be spoken in short-form spectacle. And if you try to force that sacred conversation into a daily performance schedule, you end up replacing depth with display and trading the journey for a stage. Let's start with the most basic lens: attention economics, because on modern platforms, attention is the currency, the marketplace, and the trophy. And every post is an invitation for others to purchase a piece of your day, your face, your feeling, or your opinion with their gaze, their like, their comment, which feel like income, even though what you're selling is the privacy that sustains your sanity. And non-posters often understand, consciously or intuitively, that their attention budget is small and precious, and that every time they create something for the feed, they need to spend afterward in comments, replies, micro-conflicts, or parasocial maintenance. So they simply decide to keep their attention invested in a portfolio called real life. From a personality standpoint, many non-posters score high on conscientiousness, a preference for order, goals, and self-discipline, and moderate to high on introversion or ambiversion, which doesn't mean they dislike people, but that they recharge away from crowds. And social media is a crowd in the pocket, always clapping, booing, gesturing, and gossiping within a rectangle. And for these people, the crowd ingests energy faster than it returns it, so they turn the volume down. Not to escape life, but to preserve quality of participation in the parts of life that are not performative. You also encounter a high degree of self-differentiation, the ability to hold your beliefs, values, and emotions without being hijacked by the emotional temperature of the group, because posting invites heat, judgment, flaming, and the itch to self-justify, and the non-poster knows that if they feed that itch, their day becomes a continuous courtroom where they must defend their worth with evidence, and that courtroom never closes, so they choose another court, the court of their conscience, where the verdict is rendered not by clicks but by fidelity to inner standards. Consider the spotlight effect, the cognitive bias where we overestimate how much others are noticing us, because social media amplifies it mercilessly, making us believe that our breakfast, bench press, or heartbreak is a public event with an audience of jurors. And non-posters often learned, sometimes the hard way, that the world is not watching, and that this is a gift, because freedom begins when the imaginary audience goes home, and when the audience goes home, the play can end and life can begin. There is also the question of identity coherence, because every post is a stitch in the visible narrative of who I am. And the more you stitch for strangers, the more your private self must negotiate with your public brand, especially if your posts start to accumulate returns like status, opportunities, or money. and then the brand begins to manage the human instead of the human managing the brand. And non-posters often refuse this inversion, not because they hate opportunity, but because they refuse to mortgage their soul to pay for it. Many non-posters practice what I call attention asceticism, a chosen restraint that prevents the mind from being trained like a lab rat to chase micro rewards. And this restraint is not joyless, it is spacious. It is like intermittent fasting for the psyche. It restores sensitivity to novelty and wonder. It makes a simple sunset vivid again because the eye is no longer numb from 1,000 scrolls. And this is not anti-technology. It is pro-human capacity for depth. There's another layer, competence and craft ethics, because if your work requires deep focus, writing, building, coding, research, design, leadership, your brain must sustain long, unbroken corridors of attention, and the push-pull of posting fragments those corridors into alleys. And you will notice that many excellence-driven people go quiet on social, not because they are antisocial, but because the chef must be in the kitchen, and the kitchen has heat, noise, and deadlines, and no one eats well if the chef spends the afternoon editing a reel. At the emotional level, non-posters often demonstrate a lower external validation dependency, meaning they derive their daily sense of "I'm okay" from internal references, progress toward a goal, the integrity of a decision, the fulfillment of duty, rather than external feedback loops. And because the social feed primarily offers praise, envy, criticism, or indifference, they simply bypass the casino and collect their winnings directly from the work itself, which is the only stable payout in the long run. Now, let's bring in archetypes, because Jungian psychology gives us a richer vocabulary than introvert versus extrovert. And in many non-posters, we see the hermit, not the recluse, but the inner scholar who protects wisdom from the market, and the warrior, not the brawler, but the disciplined guardian of territory who chooses battles worth fighting, and also the king or queen, not the tyrant, but the one who governs a domain with order and standards. And you cannot govern the inner kingdom if you leave the gates open to every passing comment. The shadow also matters because every human, posting or not, has unintegrated content, fears, envies, and wounds. And some people do avoid social media because of unresolved shame or trauma, and their silence is escape rather than sovereignty. But the mature non-poster is not hiding. They are selecting. They have faced enough of their shadow to know that certain environments spike their reactivity. And because they value their relationships and sanity, they refuse to pour gasoline on a fire they are still learning to manage. Think about attachment styles and parasocial bonds too, because the platforms engineer relationships without reciprocity. And if you are anxiously attached, you might play the marathon of posting to never feel forgotten, while the avoidantly attached might weaponize silence to feel in control. But the psychologically integrated non-poster is different. They are secure without an audience. They do not fear disappearing because they did not outsource their existence to strangers. And this makes their presence offline heavier, more trustworthy, less hungry.